Welcome to the Koinos podcast, which is all about turning passions into livelihoods, which sounds super cheesy. I get that. But the thing is that we are in the midst of several technological revolutions that for the first time in history will make it possible, I think, for anyone to actually turn their passions into their livelihoods if they want to, if they have the knowledge to do so. And I think that the most transformative of the technologies that we're seeing right now are obviously AI, but also blockchain and cryptocurrencies, which are enabled by blockchain. All of that is why I'm really excited to have my great friend, Professor David Roberts, who is a professor of computer science.
Yep.
Is that correct?
That is correct.
Dr. David Roberts, I should say.
David
Actually,
has, in some countries you use both, Professor Doctor.
Professor Doctor. Oh, nice. Professor Dr. Mr. Esquire Senior. But David, or Dave, as I like to call him, Dr. Roberts, has been teaching me about artificial intelligence since before it was cool. And he also has a deep understanding of blockchain. So I feel like this is going to be a really interesting conversation. So welcome to the Koinos podcast, David.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
So what do you think about what I just said? What's most interesting to you? Where are we going without rehashing all the generic bullshit we're hearing everybody say?
Yeah. Well, I think you're right in that we're at a very interesting time from the perspective of accessibility of technology and the ability for transformational change to occur outside of these siloed powers of massive corporations. And I think there's several tailwinds or several factors that are all sort of coming together around the same time to create the context and where this is possible. Most notably, of course, access to technology, which, I think there's still improvements that can be made. I'm not trying to suggest that's a solved problem yet, but never before has the barrier been lower for people to connect to the internet, to have powerful computing resources at their disposal, but also critically to have access to the information that allows them to get started and make progress on those technologies. And I think AI is a really interesting example of this. And I think blockchain is moving in that direction. I don't think it's quite as mature an ecosystem as AI, but it's very clear. And especially, being a very interested spectator of the Koinos blockchain and, being great friends with you, Andrew, and having spoken to you for years about Koinos group and what you're trying to accomplish, it's clear to me that the direction of blockchain is similar to AI. But I'll cite TensorFlow, I think, is a really transformative example. And in case anyone's not familiar with TensorFlow, TensorFlow is one of the software packages that drives a substantial percentage of work in modern artificial intelligence, particularly neural networks, so data-driven artificial intelligence. But TensorFlow is really disruptive in the field because it was designed in such a way that people like me with a PhD in machine learning can innovate in artificial intelligence technologies using this software package, but it's also approachable enough that somebody with a modicum of programming experience, access to the internet, and a laptop can also learn these technologies very effectively on their own. And it's accomplished not just by TensorFlow, the software package, but also the ecosystem that's built around it, which includes open source data sets, tutorials, discussion boards and forums, and it's created this momentum. Now, it's not unique anymore. There are other packages that compete with it, but I think a large part of the disruption that we're seeing in AI is due to the fact that so many more people can now access the technology and use it effectively, right? So it's the confluence of these computing resources, access to this internet, the software being designed in such a way that you can innovate but also approach it effectively, and then the educational materials that surround that, that's created the context. And I think, like I said, blockchain I don't think is quite as mature, but I know it's moving in that direction, and I'm very, very excited to see what starts to come of it in the not too distant future.
That's all super interesting, and I think super valuable information, and in many senses validates my thinking on it. I definitely agree that blockchain generally is far from mature. And I think that's part of what makes it so exciting. Like, I'm too late to AI. Like, I didn't get it. I didn't get it like you got it. You know, we had that call the other day where I was like, I didn't own NVIDIA, but you did, didn't you? You know? um,
Yep.
so like we can be, I think what excites us and what gets us out of bed every day and into work is the fact that there's so much work needs to be done to make this better, and to bring this new technology to the point where AI is where you have all of these competitors, you know, fighting
Yeah.
to make it even more accessible. So there were
Yeah.
a couple of major themes that you touched on that I want to highlight. I think are super interesting, and I think we'll segue nicely into what I want to talk about next. You know, you basically talked about the importance of accessibility and the risk associated with having centralized control over a
Yep.
domain, and the benefits that come from increasing accessibility. You know, and so obviously, like, Koinos is all about accessibility, but there is a technical issue here, and I think one of the ways that we could approach this is, you know, my intuition is that when we look at, okay, I think a way to get at this is through a fear that I have, which is that AI, because it benefits so much from scale, inevitably leads to a large corporation being in control. And I think my gut, a lot of people's instincts and fears are that this might happen, that because of the scale issue, that it's just inevitable. You know, I almost feel like OpenAI and Google and Microsoft are all basically saying this, and NVIDIA too. Not that I necessarily think that these are, you know, bad people, but it's almost like they're like, yeah, you guys know we're going to be kings, right? That's why our valuations are trillions of dollars.
But keep in mind that OpenAI was an upstart, right? So Google, your Microsoft, you know, your Nvidia, these are companies that have been around for a very long time, right? Got their start in the 80s and 90s. They were behemoths working on AI for a very long time, but who was the major disruptor in the last, you know, couple of years was OpenAI. Now, admittedly, it
Without
had backing
question.
from some very wealthy people. There's no question in my mind that their pockets were deep, but they were not unreasonably deep for a startup, right? And I think, admittedly, OpenAI was not the sole inventor of these technologies, but they were the one that brought it to market first in a way that was super disruptive. And I think I read an article yesterday that 2 years ago they had a headcount of 20 something, and now they're close to 1,000, right? So this disruption occurred at a time when that company was not massive, right? Now, you're not wrong that AI, being so data hungry and resource intensive, favors the wealthy incumbents. You're absolutely right about that. But I think OpenAI is a great example of how, if you're able to demonstrate something useful and disruptive like that, the resources come, right, to achieve that scale.
I'm wondering if you can talk about the technical advantages to increasing accessibility. My point being, like you said, OpenAI, being small, was able to disrupt. There are benefits to being small. There are technical advantages. And I think there's some broader secular changes in, the economy that support this. But maybe one potential route to get there is to bring in the blockchain aspect, because I think a lot of people's instincts are to say, yes, there is this danger of centralization in the artificial intelligence space, therefore blockchain. However, my intuition, and also obviously I talk to my co-founders who are more, are serious computer scientists, and we talk about this, and it's like, our intuition is like, okay, I mean, we're glad you're looking at blockchain and you're thinking about this. And yes, blockchain, it's natural if your goal is decentralization, and if you're observing these broader trends towards decentralization and the power, it's natural to think about blockchain. But it seems like pretty much everybody, is pretty off the mark with the implementations.
Yeah.
So is there something there?
I think you're right in poking a little bit of a hole in my argument, which is not one that was unknown to me, but the potential downsides of democratizing access to technology in the manner that I used TensorFlow as an example to describe, of course, is that you have people that are not necessarily trained in the development of commercially viable or production ready software artifacts or technology artifacts that are able to put things out there. But you're right, like that's a potential issue. But again, I sort of lean on the fact that if you demonstrate value, the resources to scale that and to plug holes in perhaps poor design practices come, right? And so, again, I don't view that as a liability. I view that sort of as the natural growth of technology that arises from having a lower barrier to entry, right?
Yeah, and we see a similar thing with Koinos. You make blockchain more accessible. You get more tokens that you have no idea what's going on,
Right.
what the idea is behind this, and what the business model is.
Absolutely.
More people means more experimentation, means more weird stuff and useless stuff,
but
but
that's
also
okay.
more useful stuff. Yeah,
that's okay, right? I mean, maybe sitting in the academic ivory tower, my perspective is a little bit skewed. Although, as you know, Andrew, that's not the only place I sit, right? I do work on startups. I've worked on several. So I think I have a good perspective on both sides. But, the reality is that a lot of really disruptive innovations come from really out there crazy ideas, right? Things that may not have even necessarily had a commercial application in mind at the time of their invention. You look at like GPS, which is a prolific technology that I guarantee you every single person listening to this podcast relies on, if not daily, very regularly. That was never designed with commercial application in mind. That was designed for military use, right, to solve a real problem for the military. And then it became clear there was good use for it elsewhere, right? So I think the idea that you get a lot of really crazy stuff is totally fine. I mean, to me, that's a sign of the health of the ecosystem, right? And you look at the statistics for startups. 90% of startups fail. Right. And I would say probably an equal number. I don't have data to back this up, but just my guess is an equal percentage of ideas never even make it to a startup phase, probably even more than that. Right. And so, the advantage in my mind of having such a broadly accessible technology stack that facilitates this experimentation is that you grow your numbers, right? And if your success rate is 0.5%, if you have 0.5% of ideas that are going to ultimately go on to become successful technologies, and if maybe even 0.5% of those become disruptive technologies, the way that you achieve that is through scale, right? And the way that you get scale, and scale in this sense being more ideas as opposed to scaling a company, right? And the more ideas you get them by having lower barriers to entry. Yes, they're going to require some incubation, right? They're going to require some expertise to nurture them and bring them to fruition. And there may be some that are great that never make it through the gauntlet of becoming successful, but you don't get there by investing in a tiny slice of the potential technologies and making it so that only really well-resourced companies can be successful. Right. And I'll cite the challenges that Google has had in releasing an AI product. Right. Google is one of the,
Hilarious. Like,
yeah, I mean,
thank you.
and it's actually even funnier to me because Google is the company behind TensorFlow, right? So they're sort of in part responsible for this disruptive AI technology revolution that's happening, but they've not been able to successfully deliver the product. And I guarantee you they have every bit of engineering knowledge they could possibly need at their disposal, but that doesn't necessarily mean they've been able to successfully do what OpenAI has done. Now, I think they will get there with time. Don't get me wrong, but it's fascinating to me that OpenAI is the organization that got there first and has really been that disruptive driving force, right? And I think it just speaks volumes to this idea that you need to bring more people in and set the occasion for incubation of ideas and development so that more and more technologies can run this gauntlet to go on to become successful. Right.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that these major tech companies started as very flat or AKA decentralized organizations, and they leveraged this craziness, this chaos, this experimentation that comes from decentralization to produce really powerful products. And then it seems like this natural trend where it's just really hard to stay on top, especially as things are trending towards more decentralization, more compute in the hands of individuals. One really interesting phenomenon that I just want to point out to you that I think you'll find interesting is that within the Koinos ecosystem, what we're seeing is a lot of floating, a lot of engineers working on many projects.
Yep.
Right. And I think this is an intuitive understanding of that dynamic that you highlighted, where the point is not that every project be a breakout success. Maybe the Conio web wallet is going to be a huge payments application, or maybe it will just be a critical piece of infrastructure. I don't know. Right. So you have that developer working on multiple projects.
Door number 3, there may be some little nugget of a feature in there that proves valuable for some technology that has not even been thought of yet. And 3 years from now, it's resurrected in order to enable something new that is not in existence today,
Yeah. I would even argue that the thing that people have such difficulty wrapping their minds around is the fact of what you said. Yeah. That is the thing, and we don't know what it is.
Yeah.
Right? So
but the technology has staying power, right? I mean, the platform, the context. I mean, people have been working on, AI as a term was coined 80 years ago, right? And it's really only been in the last decade or so that we've started to see it achieve commercial viability. Right.
It's the potential. Yeah. It's the unbounded potential of this technology that is the thing.
Yeah.
And when you look at technologies that are inherently limited, it just means that they're limited. They may produce incredible value. I mean, GPS is, to my understanding, inherently limited, but obviously also insanely valuable.
Well, so
if you had to put a price on it, trillions, right?
So, GPS is limited in a sense in what it can do. But when you think about the early incarnations of GPS technologies, right, you had to go and buy this $200, $300 device that was in your car, right? And it was painful, right? People did it because there was value to it, but it was painful. Now, the technology exists in your phone, and not everybody, but almost everybody has a phone. And so it was not that the GPS technology itself was able to accomplish that disruption. It was the confluence of GPS with access through a phone that made GPS so prolific, right?
And interestingly, a general purpose computer.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah,
I
and I
interrupted you.
think that's one of the interesting trends that you're seeing in AI, which it's interesting to think what this might look like in the blockchain space. But the understanding, as you said earlier, AI, modern AI, is so resource intensive, but so many of these companies are focusing now on how do you make these things resource efficient to the point where they can run on phones, heck, run in your refrigerator, run on your car, right? And I think it's interesting in my mind to do the thought experiment. What does that mean if you were to have a similar trend in blockchain, right? Because it in many ways, blockchain is so much better suited for that computation model where stuff is happening at the edge because it is decentralized, right? From its very core, right? But I don't think that we think about that as much, right, in the context of blockchain applications, right? What would a DApp look like that really embraced this idea of getting out to the absolute edge, right? We're not talking about individually controlled servers decentralized, but we're talking about on your phone, on your watch, right? I don't know what that looks like, but that's a fascinating thing to think about in my mind.
Yeah, well, and I guess that's probably what gets you interested, what maintains your interest in Koinos, because really that's what it's all about. How do we drive down the computational resources to run a node? How do we
Yeah,
make it reduce the friction for operating this thing? How do we enable applications where you don't even know you're using it? So I want to end.
absolutely. And it's
Uh,
that latter one, by the way, that I think is really, really interesting, right?
oh, what was the last one?
How do you build applications so the end user doesn't even know they're
Yeah.
using the blockchain, right?
Mm,
And it just feels like a Web 2.0 experience to them.
interesting. Is
When
there
you can
anything else you want
unlock
to say on
that,
that?
that's where I think the massive driver of adoption of blockchain comes from.
Interesting. Is there anything? Do you have any more thoughts on that?
Well, I think, having gotten into the blockchain space, I don't want to say relatively late, but later than many. And, being a computer scientist and very technically minded, I still found the barrier to entry quite daunting, right? Just first of all, wrapping your head around the idea of the model of account ownership and,
That
right, what it
says
means.
so much. That you felt the barriers were too high.
I
Wow.
felt it was substantially high, right? And I actually remember when Koinos was doing its launch, its ERC20 token allocation, right? The mining fair launch. I remember we have a mutual friend that was interested, and I remember having gone through figuring it all out, and buying my mining setup and getting everything set up and automated to the way I wanted it. And we had a mutual friend that was also interested, and I remember trying to explain to him what I had to do in order to participate, and he was basically his response was, "Yeah, there's no way in hell I'm going to figure that out." Right? And then I was like, okay, well, maybe you can just go like buy some coin tokens on Uniswap. And I tried to explain to him the process of, getting an account on a centralized exchange, and then, setting up a MetaMask wallet or whatever, and even that was just too much. And this is not, our mutual friend. This is a well-educated,
A very intelligent person, yes,
very,
but
very
not
intelligent.
technical.
You know who I'm talking about, right?
I do.
I won't besmirch his reputation by mentioning his name, but long story short, as clear as you made that, and I think you released amazing documentation at the time. You provided the tools that people needed to do it, right, with the miner that you released, and it still was, I mean, is the best that I have seen in the blockchain space in terms of helping people onboard to something that would allow them to participate. But it was still a massive lift to accomplish it if you weren't
Yeah.
already familiar with how to operate in the blockchain space.
Yeah,
So
I agree with all of that. It was, we did our best. I'm
you
happy
did.
with what we did,
Yeah, it was
but
unbelievable.
it was proof of the thesis that the
Yeah.
existing technologies were just too inherently unpleasant to use.
Yeah. I wish I knew who to attribute this quote to, but I have a coffee mug that's been a favorite of mine for, I hate to think of how long, probably close to 30 years. And the quote, it's one of those color changing mugs. And when you put hot coffee in it, it reveals a quote that says, any sufficiently advanced technology should be indistinguishable from magic. Right. And so that to me, it's a little bit tongue in cheek, but that to me really describes what the experience should look like. If you want to use blockchain, ideally you wouldn't actually know what the heck is going on. You would sign up for an account the way you sign up for an account on any other web page, right? And you would just start using and interacting. Maybe you give a credit card to get some money, tokens, or crypto assets or whatever kind, and then things just start happening in a way that's leveraging the benefits of blockchain, which I think can make things advantageous for all users, right? Not just sort of centralized with uh, the operators of the product, accomplishing that, right? Providing that sort of Web 2.0 experience, even though you're living on the blockchain, is, I think, really, really important. And I think that's one of the things that, as you've correctly pointed out many times over the years, is one of the things that Koinos is really aiming to accomplish. And I think making great strides in that direction.
Thank you. Yeah, I love that quote. I totally agree with it 100%.
Yeah.
And I've been thinking a lot lately about how do we get there? And it's always difficult, right? Because of what you said, where it's not our job to know what's going to work. You can't know. You need the experimentation. But
Yep.
lately, I've been thinking about how burn pools deliver anywhere from between a 4% to an 8% return. And I feel like there's some huge opportunity there where imagine you sign up for the Conio wallet or some game or some app, and you just sign in. And as a natural part of using that application, you start to be able to participate
Yep.
in this return.
Yep.
Like you have to obfuscate everything. So maybe your exchange, you're like swapping your USD for a stable coin in the background, and
Yeah.
that stable coin is whatever, right? It has to be obfuscated. But imagine you can use an app like you would normally use, but just get more money back in a
Yeah.
kind of stable but sufficiently random to be a little bit fun
Mm-hmm.
way. I
Yeah.
feel like that could be the underpinning
Yeah.
of what makes these apps inherently compelling. But
Yeah.
I want to make sure that before I let you go, that I get your perspective on the confluence of AI and blockchain. You mentioned a term that I wonder that
Mm.
I think could be really powerful, and I'm wondering if you can tie these two things together. But I suspect that this idea of technology artifacts,
Yeah.
I think that's a critical component of your mental model that I think most people probably, nobody thinks about it that way. A very small number of people think about it that way.
Yeah. I can't claim ownership of that one, but
No,
yes.
no, yeah, yes, you can, but right, like the people with the esoteric knowledge are the ones who are able to leverage that knowledge, most efficiently. And so I'm wondering, is there, so how should we think about yes, AI and blockchain are two powerful trends that we're seeing right now. How do we think about them interacting with one another, and is this idea of technology artifacts useful in this analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. I assume you're referring to my provenance idea that I mentioned the other day.
If that is the best
Yeah,
way to explore it, I don't know if you've had
sure,
other thoughts. I mean,
sure.
I assume since that's the best idea you felt worth sharing, that it's probably a good
Fair enough.
approach.
Fair enough. So let me. I will use this as a concrete example of sort of how I think about leveraging technologies when I attempt to innovate, right? Whether that's in my research as a professor or in the startups that I'm involved in. And, one of the things that I think, uh, aside from the sort of general goal of like a good product is always going to address some pain point, right? So you always need to start from that perspective, right? What's the actual problem that we're trying to solve? But when you then look at ways to solve that problem, I like to sort of evaluate potential approaches based on the things that they do well and the things that they don't do well, right? So in my mind, when I look at AI, one of the big problems that is out there is this idea of data provenance, right? Uh, so many companies have generated massive enterprise value based on just a data set, right? The value in the product is the insights that their AI are able to derive from the data that they own. So data ownership is a really big thing, but there's also a lot of challenges that people that aren't as familiar with the way that modern AI works, that these modern machine learning algorithms work, may not be familiar with, and that challenges this notion of keeping track of how you use your data specifically in the creation of your AI artifact, right? So you have a data set, you can apply many different algorithms, many different flavors of algorithms with different settings, we call parameters, in order to produce this functioning AI. And oftentimes, when, I don't know the exact numbers, but I'll just use ChatGPT as the example, right? ChatGPT is now on version 4 or 4.5 or whatever it is publicly, right? Behind the scenes, I'm sure there are several versions ahead. But for them to release a version like version 4, they probably have evaluated hundreds or thousands of different approaches with different model configurations, right? Different parameter settings, in order to produce something that works the way that they want it to work, right? And keeping track of all that when you've got this one block of data and you're slicing it up in different ways and you're applying different algorithms is exceedingly complicated. And doing it in a centralized way is has some advantages, but when you start to think about opening up and bringing in more and more people and organizations, doing it in a decentralized way is an absolute nightmare, right? And I also look at blockchain, and one of the things that blockchain is amazing at is decentralized ownership, right? Sort of keeping track, a permanent record of who owns what and how it gets used. And so the idea of marrying these things in order to provide a better way to keep track of data ownership, AI model ownership, and be able to put these artifacts out there for broader use and adoption while still maintaining your ownership and of those assets, is, I think, a really fascinating way to think about marrying technologies, right? Uh, and so I think, I use this as an example of the way that I like to think about technology artifacts. And that is like, what are they good at? What are they not good at? What are the holes? And are there ways to think of almost like a puzzle, right? If in my head, and I know this sounds pretty strange, but in my head, these different technologies almost look like puzzle pieces, right? In terms of their capabilities, right? Their capabilities, they might have core capabilities that sort of fit nicely into a rectangle, but then each one sort of pushes the boundary a little bit and it creates a little bump in what it can do. And finding one that fits, so these two technologies, the bumps are complementary and you're plugging holes, is the best metaphor I can describe for how I think about these technological artifacts and the landscape and putting them together in order to solve a problem and drive innovation.
And ultimately, we're trying to achieve something here, right? The question is, how do we combine these things so as to create the society? It's not innovation for innovation's sake, right? It's an attempt to create the society that we want. Is, do you think of it like that?
Well, I think, maybe I'm a little bit idealistic, but I don't think that innovation for the sake of innovation and working towards creating a society that you want to create are necessarily distinct things. Uh, because, as I said, right, so many disruptive technologies have come from happenstance, right? From serendipitous discovery. Antibiotics are a great example, right? And so I think that it's absolutely critical that people are focusing on a goal of accomplishing something impactful in society. I'm not trying to minimize that, but I think that there's a risk in only doing that, of sort of over optimizing for that particular thing, when there may be new ways to accomplish that, or there may be new goals that we haven't even thought of yet, because you know technology to even think that they're possible hasn't reached our imagination. So I think it's important that we also have technology innovation just for the sake of innovation. And they both need to happen, right? If we had focused on optimizing farming technology the way that it existed in the 1800s, we wouldn't be able to feed the world's population today, right? And it was the innovation in other fields that ended up coming over and joining the work that was being done in food supply and food security that created a force multiplier, right? And to the point that, like, nowadays, farming is as much based on the historical knowledge that's been handed down from generation to generation as it is on AI, right? And data and genetics, right? And these fields that at face value have absolutely nothing to do with agriculture are fundamental drivers. And in order to be competitive in agriculture, well, you almost have to now be comfortable with analytics and AI and genetics, at least a modicum of understanding of how those things work, so that you can take those tools and apply them effectively in your craft.
But isn't there an underlying assumption in a lot of what you're talking about that distributing power amongst the largest number of nodes is desirable, but it's part of achieving innovation, that these things are intertwined?
Yes. In my mind, yes. I think that well, I don't want to say distributing power. Power, maybe power and resources are.
Yeah, that is the most like polarizing way to put it. Yeah, and
So
vague.
distributing resources, right, or at least access to resources, if not ownership of resources, but access to resources, I think is fundamentally critical. Absolutely. I'm completely on board with that. But the flip side is, I think that there are certain innovations and certain technologies that may build off of or be born from this more democratized access to resources, but they are incubated and grown in a more centralized way, right? And I may not be the popular view in the blockchain community, but I do think that there is room for that type of innovation, and in some cases it's critical, even if the enabling technology, the thing that makes it possible for these technologies to incubate and grow, is the democratized nature of the network's resources, right? I mean, let's be honest, right? Economics is a great motivator, right? If I'm sure that there are many people that participate in blockchain technology, in the creation of dApps, that are driven by a desire to make a profitable business, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? I mean, it's part of the way that the world works, and generating value. If you're generating value for your customers, you're generating value for your business, and those things can be well aligned.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree. I think a profit motive is certainly a good thing, and I think that I view decentralized organizations as an important check, a great new addition to the global economy, and an important check on centralized organizations. But the idea should not be to get rid of them. Entirely. All right. We could talk for hours. I want to be considerate of your time, and I'd love to have more conversations with you in the future. So I think
Happy
now would be
to.
a good time to end it, unless you have anything you'd like to add.
No, I don't. I was just about to go on a rant about confederate versus federated systems, but we'll save that
Next
for the
time.
next time. Lots of fun, man. Appreciate the opportunity to drop by and have the conversation.
Great chatting. Talk soon.
Bye.
Thanks for watching this episode of the Koinos podcast. Don't forget to follow Koinos Network on Twitter and YouTube. You can also listen to the Koinos podcast on your favorite podcasting platform.